It is just a pleasure.
For life.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, we've had a great day of programming from our nation's leading market participants as well as regulators, and it really brings me no greater pleasure to have these two commissioners sitting next to me today, Kara Stein and Brian Quintenz. Great people, great regulators, thought leaders, and I think all of us are very interested in getting their views on financial technology and really the direction of both agencies. Kara was appointed by President Obama and sworn into the SEC in 2013. She is the Commission's liaison to the North American Securities Administrators Association, represents the Commission at meetings of the International Organization of Securities Commissions, or IOSCO, and is an ardent supporter of furthering diversity and inclusion initiatives at the SEC. Commissioner Stein joined the Commission after serving as a senior policy advisor for Jack Reed. She's also served as a staff director of the Securities, Insurance, Investment Subcommittee of the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. And she's led a number of important initiatives for a variety of senators on the Hill and graduated from, again, that unknown small school of Yale.
In New Haven.
Yeah, the New Haven School.
Well, I had 2 formative years at Georgetown. At the Center for Applied Legal Studies.
Well,
with a teaching
and speaking of a Georgetown alum, we have Brian Quintenz, who's...
So Georgetown Law School invited me back before the Georgetown MBA program did. Maybe that was on purpose. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah. Well, you know where to go. You know where to go. You're Saxon. But Brian was nominated by President Trump to be the commissioner of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission. He is the newest commissioner and was unanimously confirmed by the Senate on August 3rd, 2017, and was sworn into office on August 15th for the remainder of a 5-year term expiring in 2020. He started his career in finance at Hill Townsend Capital, a registered investment advisor, established to focus solely on U.S. bank and financial company investment opportunities. While there, he performed rigorous fundamental valuation analysis on regional and global banks, projected future earnings estimates.
It's okay, I'm getting bored.
And knows, more importantly for a law school, math, which is very, very useful. And he graduated magna cum laude from Duke and his MBA from Georgetown.
Thanks, Chris.
It is an absolute pleasure to have you. So we've already had the acting comptroller of the currency here earlier today. He had talked about things like the FinTech Charter, initiatives to think about financial innovation and the like. And one of the questions that I asked him was, as you develop and roll out these programs, to what degree and at what point in the process is it necessary for the banking regulators to coordinate with the market regulators? Which brings up really, I think, our first initial.
What did he say?
He said,
That's a good question.
Well, it was actually a more complicated question because I had asked whether or not you have to coordinate with the OCC in terms of the development of its policy, whether or not, particularly in the piloting of different testing of different bank regulatory products, and then secondly, whether or not the OCC, when engaged in the rule writing process, is engaging with its market regulators. And that was a question that was planted by me, or to me by someone affiliated with one of your 2 regulatory agencies, whom I will not identify, but it was still a very good question. But part of that question also involves, well, what exactly are the visions of financial innovation and regulation by our regulators? And in particular, for each of you, I have our first question. Where do you see the SEC and the CFTC fitting into the puzzle of financial innovation and regulation? What kinds of activities either are currently in place, or what kinds of steps are the agencies taking to think through how to address financial innovation? And then also, even beyond the SEC, I'm really curious just to get your own personal views in terms of how you view financial innovation, the risks posed by financial innovation, the opportunities posed by it, and from there we can take it on to a series of more precise questions. But I'll start with you, Commissioner Stein.
I mean, I think there's incredible promise with fintech. I think we're all excited about what some of those opportunities are, whether it's clearing and settlement or trading, investing. I think, in some sense, the Commission has been involved with technology for quite some time because the markets have been using computers to trade. Just think about, basically trading is now computers all over the world interacting with one another. So it's sort of a misnomer to think we're not in there, sort of across divisions interacting with technology. But I think clearly if we want our markets to remain the best in the world, we've got to basically be out there on the edge with technology, embracing it, while at the same time making sure market integrity and investor protection are protected, which is ultimately what the regulatory role is. So I think we need to keep thinking through how best to do that. You probably know I've been advocating for an Office of Data Strategy. I mean, I think one of the things that a lot of government agencies, the Commission included, are in this new world, the digital age, and we have silos within our organization that collect data, and we're interacting with data streams from all over the world. And it's actually understanding, sometimes I compare it to a library. People can access data when they have the right library card, and anyone in our agency can access it. Think about how I've been pushing the idea of requiring all of our disclosure to be done through a structured format, which would basically mean you could, my vision would be you should be able to pull up 3 companies registered with us and compare them the way you can compare toasters, right, on the internet. Why shouldn't a company be able to, much like TurboTax, just input data and then it populates our forms, whatever forms we're talking about. So thinking about how we can take the functions that we do and use data better, more efficiently to do it. So I think that's, it's a version of rethinking where we are in the market and how we can best serve the market, and at the same time make sure the market is, again, has integrity and is protecting investors and using technology to do it.
So, Brian, what are your priorities at the Commission, and particularly how they relate to the supervision and cultivation of financial innovation?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. Well, before I get into that, I mean, I think building on those points and building on some of the things you said, I mean, you think about a company like Uber, and Uber doesn't think of itself as a transportation company. They think of themselves as a technology company. And I think you can make the case that a lot of the major players, a lot of the major banks, a lot of the major participants in the financial system are in the same boat. They have become financial companies, or they have become technology companies that are involved in finance. And they're not going to stop innovating. Their competitive advantage now is almost a technology competitive advantage. Technology innovation is everywhere in our financial markets. New participants are coming into the market that could displace old participants purely on a technology basis. So, I think it's absolutely imperative that we as regulators at least have conversations and at least have a process or a vehicle to be able to explore all of the great ideas that are out there, so that we can get an understanding of where technology is going. We can look at our rules to understand where things may or may not be consistent with where that technology is headed. Maybe there's an opportunity for us to use some of that technology internally to make us more efficient regulators. A lot of this, I think, is going to be a product of the Lab CFTC effort that our good friend Dan Gorfine is running. And Dan,
maybe you could sort of spell out the basic idea behind it.
Yeah, so Lab CFTC was a really a brainstorm of now Chairman John Carlo, who wanted to create a 21st century innovator or a 21st century regulator that could respond to the innovative marketplace. And he wants to use it as a way to have that communication, have that dialogue with fintech innovators. He wants to use it as a tool to interact with other international regulatory organizations so that we can share ideas and share best practices. While all of our jurisdictions have an incentive to compete for innovators themselves, we have an incentive to collaborate on regulatory technology to make sure that we can share best practices in the regulatory technology space. And to use our conversations with international regulators and with innovators to modernize the CFTC's own approach to financial market regulation. Dan is also going to be, or is, the designated federal officer, that's the term, for the Technology Advisory Committee, which is an advisory committee at the agency that uses outside experts from the industry and from academia to advise the Commission on developments in different areas. And I'm very privileged to be the sponsor of that advisory committee. And speaking of priorities, I mean, I think we have a lot of ideas for how to best use the TAC over the next 2.5 years through the remainder of my term. One would be to discuss, where are the true market risks in, the modern trading environment. I think, through the prior conversation around algorithmic trading or automated trading or the modern trading ecosystem, I didn't really see that risk appropriately identified, targeted, understood. I also didn't see an awareness of the fact that incentives are aligned here. I mean, I don't think any firm wants to have its algos act in a way that go out and cause them to lose hundreds of millions of dollars in seconds. So there's an interest on all of our parts to make sure that the environment is controlled, it's understood, and I think once we get that knowledge and set the bar there, we can try to figure out where the regulatory gaps are that need to be filled. Then there's the issue of cybersecurity and data protection, what the CFTC is doing with our data. Our Office of Data and Technology that we have has communicated to me that they don't feel like they actually have a great vehicle for talking to our registrants or for all the folks that send us very important data. And this may be a great opportunity for us to use the TAC or a subcommittee of the TAC to start having those conversations about what we're doing with people's data, how we're getting it, how we store it, what we do with it when we're done with it. And maybe that will give them comfort, or maybe it will create an opportunity for us to improve that so that we can make sure that we're only asking for the data we need, and when we get it, we're doing the best we can with it to protect it.
That's great. There are, one of the challenges and one of the questions I received when organizing this conference, I said, well, Chris, this was a 3-day conference, and part of the challenges is when you look at what financial technology involves, there are just so many different pieces, whether or not it be on the trading end and execution side, whether or not it be in cloud technology, whether or not it be in data, and the like. Commissioner Stein, have you seen, or if you were going to look at this broad universe of financial technology as it pertains to the SEC, are there any priority areas that you think, either from a risk perspective or from an opportunity perspective, warrant more urgent attention than others? I mean, you can think of either blockchain, there's the cloud,
Right.
There's algo trading. Are there any issues that either get you excited or make you sleep a little bit less at night that you think should be a focus, particularly as the new chairman, Chairman Clayton, begins to formulate his agenda for the agency?
I think that sounds like a setup question. No, I think there are incredible areas that we need to be, focused on. I basically think we need to rethink how we work in the digital age, right? I was sort of alluding to that earlier. The industry, the industry and technology are rapidly evolving, and like figuring out how to make sure the regulatory community does as well is a challenge. I had the idea of the Office of Data Strategy. We have certainly been pushing really hard for a number of years to develop a consolidated audit trail, the CAT. And one of the ideas behind that is to have a way to actually oversee a pretty fragmented market structure. And I've called it like the Hubble telescope of sort of the securities markets. But we basically need to be able to have a way to see what's happening with order flows, see what's happening with order types. Ideally, we should probably be doing it across both the commodity and futures, the commodity and the security space. The plan for the consolidated audit trail was basically proposed to the commission by the exchanges and FINRA, and includes plans to have robust security. They have a contractor they hire called Thesis, but that's sort of critical to the whole, concept. And we've approved the plan, and we're going to hold them to account for building it and also protecting the data. But that's, I think, truly revolutionary to sort of think through actually having an insight into the entire marketplace. And I think I'll go back to this. It sounds boring, but you guys are all data geeks. Actually having data that we collect in machine-readable form is critical to the regulatory community. Because basically, sometimes I say we have lots of lawyers and accountants at the commission, and they tend to think about things in terms of text. And really the revolution here is things are being done in numbers now, right? It's data. And learning, getting everything that we actually have submitted to us be machine readable allows private industry to do really cool things, right, in the reg tech and the fintech space. And it also allows us to do data analytics and really cool things, in our space. So it's like this foundational building block that, all of you should go away in whatever context you're coming from and, insist the government start to do this. It's just critically important to all of these projects that we're talking about.
So one of the consistent themes over the last 2 days has been cybersecurity. We had like a money laundering panel earlier with the head of PayPal's money laundering, the FBI officer in charge basically of technology and money laundering. We had Jeremy Kroll yesterday, who's K2 intelligence outfit.
Hopefully they're in charge of anti-money laundering.
That's true.
Yeah,
this is true.
yeah.
This is day two. It's day two. I just give you through day three. One of the recurring themes is really how cybersecurity keeps people up at night, both on the public sector and in the private sector. From the Edgar hack to Equifax, there's a real concern that to the extent to which society moves to a digitally based infrastructure, there are the security of the warehousing of our data becomes something that becomes more critical, mission critical, but also something where there are always some blind spots. Have you guys given, I know Brian, you're very new to the commission, but have you given some thought as to how cybersecurity would fit into, if not just lab CFTCs, but your work at the TAC and more generally into how the CFTC is looking to stay and to position itself as a 21st century regulator?
Yeah, so I think about cybersecurity, in kind of two ways, and for lack of a better way of describing it, one is the internal process for cybersecurity in terms of what we do with the data that the CFTC has, and then there's the external aspect from our position as regulators, what we're advising or telling or suggesting through regulation that firms do with their data. I think the TAC is best positioned to address the first part of that, to accept feedback from the industry around our own technology and our own safety safeguards, our own provisions. I think, you know, we need to do everything we can to create a very, very low probability of an event. But we also have to have the mindset of how do we minimize the effects when an event happens. We can't afford to let that other piece, you know, assume that it will never happen. And I think that that's why we need to have a process, and the chairman has called for this. We need to have a process to identify all the ways that we collect very sensitive information, personally identifiable information, and make sure that we absolutely critically need it. You know, I think that there's going to be at some point a tremendous opportunity to use blockchain or DLT to transform this reporting mechanism. You know, currently we require firms and registrants to push at a tremendous cost a lot of data to us in ways that may not be readable, processable, that we can't use analytics around. You know, at some point, hopefully soon, there may be an opportunity for that to be stored in a way that they want, and for us as regulators to have a regulatory node on a DLT platform, and we can pull it, you know, in a way that's a very low cost for them and us and more efficient. You know, I want to start having those types of conversations. Where is this going? How can we be involved? How can we do this on the front end so that it makes everyone's lives easier and safer?
Well, you know, we've had a number of conversations over the last 2 days with lots of folks in the DLT space, and have mentioned that the technology is potentially applicable not just to sort of trade execution, but just from a reporting standpoint, which is something that has become increasingly important for the CFTC, particularly after Dodd-Frank, and even for international harmonization of data, that it obviates some of the questions that have caused frictions between the EU and the United States with regards to its reporting. And I think that that's going to be a really interesting thing, and I think there are more than a couple of people here who would want to have conversations with you about that.
Great.
Kara, I guess sort of similarly, you know, it's hard for regulatory agencies to respond sometimes to radical changes in market infrastructure and market environment. I mean, even when you go all the way back to the back office crises of the 1960s and 70s, when there's something called a computer and all of a sudden people didn't know what to do with it, right? I mean, this is not the first time that the SEC or a regulatory agency itself has ever met this or seen that there was a challenge that was tied to changes in how market participants participated and how investors invested. What I think is new or different is the pace at which the changes are changing the market ecosystem. And I think that what we heard from a couple of lawyers as pertaining to the OCC, when he said we'll have the fintech charter at some point, and the question was how soon, seems so slow, you know, is how quickly can regulatory agencies adapt, and what kinds of processes can one put in place, not just from a sort of market enabling standpoint, but also from a market supervision standpoint. You know, how exactly can, you know, those New Deal agencies respond to 21st century digitally based infrastructures? Are there changes that are, you know, you've been at the commission now and you know how it works from the inside out. Do you see differences in strategy that may be useful to consider, or different kinds of constellations of work processes? And then how does that apply across agencies when, for example, you talk to the CFTC, and I know that Chairman Clayton has in mind some kind of increasing harmonization of SEC and CFTC rules. You know, you're adding on several different work processes and streams on top of one another. And as someone who's been in the chair for a while, what kinds of things run through your mind in terms of how to position the agency to meet those kinds of challenges?
I mean, one part of this is funding. So I just want to point out, I like to throw this number out, but one major Wall Street firm, spends $9.5 billion a year on technology, just on technology, not other parts of their budget. And that's 5 times the SEC's entire budget. So we have had, basically chronic underfunding. And CFTC has too. Brian hasn't been around long enough to quite fully experience that. So we're starved for funding to basically upgrade our technology and to some degree our infrastructure and also personnel, right? And having people with software, expertise. So there's a reserve fund that got created in the Dodd-Frank bill to fund technology products at the commission. It's been chronically underfunded. So part of this is having the funding we need to upgrade our systems and our hardware. And we can't bury our head in the sand. This is going to have to happen. The entire industry is about technology now. So the regulators are going to also have to be, I say, surfing the wave, right? Instead of being disrupted, let's surf the wave, with everyone else. And we have to make sure the data is protected, to go back to cybersecurity. And a lot of this, as everybody in this room knows, is about not only trying to do things on the front end, with good computer hygiene and teaching your employees, not to give their passwords to other people or not have their password be their dog's name or, whatever the very basic, simple things are. But also, making sure that we sort of have the best and most cutting-edge cybersecurity protocols and, tools available. So, and I think our chair is very committed in this space, and that is going to be, we're actively going to be, I think, involved in engaging on these issues. So, we're all going to, I guess at the end of the day, this is about resiliency and trying to prevent bad things from happening, and when they happen, trying to, recover quickly. And, we're all in this world together and figuring out what those protections are going to be and how we're going to help each other recover. This is really a national imperative. I talk sometimes about this being a lot, like, we're talking about what's the role of the federal government a lot of times in some of these areas. And it reminds me, early on I had, I don't know, it was 2 or 3 years ago, a clearing broker talking about asking me who they should call if they were in a denial of service attack, right? It's like, well, you can call the commission, but then it was a Homeland Security, and then it was your local FBI office. Like, letting people know, who can help you when, and quickly. And is it a 911 number? Is it a 411 number? Or another metaphor to think about it is, some people are paying for really good cybersecurity, but their neighbor next door isn't. It's not very different than the 19th century when people were paying for fire protection. It only goes so far if the building next door to you, who's not paying for fire protection, burns down, right? At some point, it implicates your, building. So a lot of this, and some of these brilliant minds, in the room, is helping all of us think through what those responses should be, both on the private side, and the public side, and how we can, basically strengthen our outer perimeter here and inner perimeters when these things happen.
Well, yeah, and that was also another thing was what happens to those entities that are right outside of the critical markets infrastructure, whether or not it be law firms, investment banks, FCMs. If they can get hacked, can you basically come through the back door and then access a clearinghouse or some kind of other critical exchange and then cause pandemonium depending on what kind of perpetrator that you have. But in terms of, again, the kind of CFTC, SEC coordination question, something that's come up more than once involved ICOs. Before getting into, I guess, how that jurisdictional dance is going to play itself out between the CFTC and the SEC, because there are lots of different potentially overlapping transactions that can trigger all kinds of alarm bells or interest by both agencies. The SEC has issued a report on ICOs. The CFTC has already begun to engage in enforcement actions. What is your general view towards? I don't want to say are you pro or anti-ICO, but what do you think about the ICO trend? It's attracted a lot of funding. Do you have any sense of the market, its merits and its demerits?
I think a lot of us have been watching the market really closely for the last several years. I hope that the report in July was helpful to the marketplace and sort of talking about when something might be considered a security. I think the CFTC is engaged in that same, activity as when something might be a commodity, in effect. And all of that's going to be facts and circumstances based. I think we're dancing together and in harmony on this. I don't actually see it as a jurisdictional, issue at all. What we're really saying is if it's some type of investment contract and you've provided money and you're going to be getting profit from it, what you're doing might be a security. And you probably should talk to a lawyer and figure that out, before you go further.
That's why we create them here.
Yeah.
Brian.
Yeah. I think ICOs or virtual currencies, virtual commodities, are really interesting. It seems as though they may actually transform at some point from something that starts off as a security and transforms into a commodity. I'm not a lawyer, but the four-part test for security, the Howey test. At some point there may be a transformation where it doesn't rely upon solely the efforts of others, and that is just in and of itself a commodity. And that's going to be a very difficult but important conversation for us to have, to give the market certainty, to allow for innovation to flourish and continue, but to make sure that we're being consistent in how we apply commodity law and the protection of consumers across all products. And you mentioned enforcement cases. Unfortunately, in my view, it was unfortunate the CFTC has started off on the process of trying to make policy through an enforcement case. There was a couple file and settle cases that said the basis of jurisdiction is that if something's a commodity and there's a commodity interest tied to that commodity, we have jurisdiction. And commodity interest can mean a number of different things. One of the things it could mean is if you are selling those products to retail investors, and if they're margin leveraged or financed, then the person doing that has to be registered with the commission as a futures commission merchant. The exception to that is if actual delivery occurs within 28 days. So now we're tasked with the process of trying to define what actual delivery means for virtual commodity. And I think that's interesting to think about. I think it's possible to do, but it hasn't been done before. And as we know from going through the process, delivery doesn't mean actual physical possession. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden, wheat shows up on your doorstep. It means that you can get a delivery slip or a warehouse receipt. So there's an ownership and control aspect to delivery, which I think can create the context for how we define delivery of a virtual commodity. But those are questions that we're working on answering, and they're going to be very important.
Well, the previous panel actually got into a discussion about that very question.
Oh, they answered it already? Okay.
No. Actually, you sounded very lawyerly, by the way, as well. We'll give you the
rubbing off on me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's a certain kind of a question in which market participants are thinking about. At what point does the utility value of a commodity sort of begin to take precedence over what you would normally associate with the security under the Howey test. And I think that there's going to have to be, or there probably will be, an interesting dialogue that plays itself out between the two agencies. One of Chairman, I had the pleasure of seeing and listening and being on at Brookings with Chairman Clayton, in which one of his first observations was, when coming into office, I'm really, really surprised by just the volume of small-time fraud that occurs in markets. And I'm sure when he looks at the ICO market, it doesn't exactly isn't a ringing sense of endorsement as to market integrity. How budget is certainly important. We had the FBI talking about using yesterday's tools for tomorrow's problems, or actually for today's problems. But how, given the resources that we do have, how does a regulatory agency position itself, and what would you like to see from the SEC in terms of how it engages market participants in terms of the question of still pretty significant fraud that happens in all of our capital markets? Is this a concern that you share, or that you continue to find problematic? I think everybody over at Brookings was taken a little bit aback that was the very first thing that came out of the chairman's mouth. Do you see a direction, or could you suggest a direction being taken when it comes to enforcement that you would like to see at the agency in light of that concern?
The chairman actually determines in our agency what the direction of enforcement will be. So that's something, just in understanding these commissions, the chairman sets the agenda, to some degree, both in the enforcement program and the rulemaking program. I do think for any commissioner coming in, I don't know if Brian's had this experience at the CFTC yet, but I basically vote on cases every week. I look at 20 to 25 basically fraud cases, and they're from all over the country, and they're Ponzi schemes and pump and dumps. It's about funding the new Ebola vaccine or machines for marijuana, you name it. Often there's, the money is not going into the fund, it's going right into somebody's pocket, it's all lies. So I think it ultimately becomes very informative and changing, changes your mentality to some degree about the marketplace, because you understand that there are all of these sort of bad things, happening. I think what it does do is it shifts you towards wanting to prevent the bad things from happening. So for example, you'll have a case where $200 million was invested, and you can track it down. It went to Hong Kong, and now it's in China. You're not getting the money back. It's very hard to get the money back at this point. For all kinds of reasons. So you want to have prevented the scam. These are cons, effectively, a lot of them, from ever happening, in the first place. I mean, an interesting thing about technology, is there a way to use technology, to actually help you, in this space? So sometimes, part of what we're focused on, the CFTC is focused on, is how can we help investors make better choices, either by encouraging them to find out about the broker or the investment advisor who they might be deciding to use before they invest the money, teaching people that when they say guaranteed 30% return, for the next 10 years, if you invest in this exotic, product, that might be a red flag. But I guess what I'm saying is there's a financial literacy component. So when you think about robo-advisors and some of the cool things you can do with AI, are there I tease about it sometimes, but like Yelp, for financial products. But, are there ways the crowd, could actually help, folks make better choices? A lot of times studies, we were just talking to someone who did a report from the Stanford Design Lab, and they were basically saying, especially young people, they're much more likely to listen to their peers and go on to a blog to find out about how they should make investment choices. Maybe they'll talk to a parent, that would be the, but thinking about how people connect, to one another and make those choices, and encouraging people to do some research beforehand. Over and over, you see people that spend a lot more time picking out a veterinarian or a doctor than they do on someone who might be in charge of their life, savings. So trying to get people to not be intimidated and just assume someone's an expert because they're holding themselves out, as a broker or a financial advisor. So, thinking again about cool things you can do with tech.
Which I'll bring with you in terms of looking at reg tech and technology as a solution to even some of the problems that technology may create. How do you view reg tech, not just fintech, but reg tech within the CFTC, and what can regulators do to help enable not just better compliance, but really how can they also enable better market participation and sort of encourage the market to take steps that ultimately lead to a healthier derivatives market?
Well, I think there are a few areas there, a few avenues. I think one is having the conversation, having the presence in the field, like we're hoping to do with Lab CFTC and Dan and all the people that hopefully will be involved with this. And I think, not only, you think of the idea of sandboxes that have been created over, in the UK and in Singapore, and I think that's a very important thing to do. And in fact, there are rules that prevent our agency, and I'm sure the SEC, from demoing technology because we have to pay for fair use of something that has value. And once we do that, it goes into a procurement process which gets bogged down in an enormous amount of red tape, and then it's almost useless and we can't do anything with it. So, there are rules that prevent us from actually getting our hands dirty a little bit with some of this stuff that could be very valuable and useful to us. So we're looking for ways to try to solve that problem. But then from a conversation aspect, I think, a lot of the sandboxes that of which I'm aware, are really designed as an on-ramp for, an onboarding process into the regulatory scheme. I think there's a lot of value to engaging with innovators that will never be a part of, the regulatory architecture, but yet service that industry, so that they're aware of all of the requirements of their clients. They're aware of how regulators might use their technology in ways to assist them, and they could innovate in a way that helps everyone. So having that conversation, I think, is also important.
It really is interesting because no one really thinks about it as much, but between Dodd-Frank for CFTC and a little bit less, obviously, for the SEC, but also the Jobs Act for the SEC, you have two specific mandates for regulators to begin to at least initiate some kind of regulatory and financial innovation, right? Under Dodd-Frank, it says, thou shalt create something called a swap data repository, and we're going to make sure that information is funneled here, to this thing that you, the CFTC and SEC are responsible for. In the case of the Jobs Act, you have portals. Thou shalt create a portal, and the portal shall operate as a new kind of financial intermediary where you post a security. And what I find fascinating when you say that is that even in terms of executing that mandate by Congress, there could be some interesting administrative stumbling blocks, which make it harder for the agencies to perhaps be able to do so in the most responsible manner. Hadn't thought about that. Okay.
Well, it'd be nice if we didn't need mandates to do that stuff. I think, and in fact, I don't. Lab CFTC didn't come out of a mandate. It came out of Chris Giancarlo and his vision for the agency, and I think that's wonderful. And swap data repositories came out of the, I think, out of the interest of informing the Commission, providing transparency, from a transparency aspect to the marketplace, which
or
is
even a CEF, thou shalt create the CEF. But right. it's fascinating. I know that there are some people who really did want to have some questions for you. So there are two microphones if you would like to ask a question of our commissioners. International I will keep talking until someone stands up, but international regulatory coordination is a big issue. It's a question as to what's coming out of Europe right now. You see questions of MiFID, which will have enormous implications for the SEC, but you also have I guess now there's been some clearinghouse, some advances in terms of clearinghouses with the EU and the US, but I guess, do you have any thoughts about, I guess I know that you've worked with IOSCO, I know there's an IOSCO board meeting this week. What is the state of play right now in your sense of transatlantic and global coordination? And then I was wondering when for the CFTC, particularly when it comes to fintech, there are so many global things that are happening internationally that you mentioned, and what kinds of thoughts you may have in terms of executing better cross-border coordination when it comes to fintech. What are the things that come to mind? What are the issue areas and the priorities? But MiFID, can we escape
That's
it?
a big question.
It's a law school.
I mean, I'm going to go back to, let me do IOSCO, and then we can talk about Europe. I think IOSCO is actually very focused on how jurisdictions can share ideas around RegTech and FinTech. We were even brainstorming at one of the meetings, like, could you come up with a fellowship or a scholarship for the best paper on how regulators, could use FinTech. That wouldn't cost any money, but you could still give someone this honor, but thinking through how you can get how you can actually get FinTech focused on helping regulators, and actually thinking through some of what regulators' needs might be, because that's really a distinct, sort of area. But I actually think IOSCO, as a group across jurisdictions, often we're sharing best practices, or we're doing effectively white papers, reports. You can see what's happening in Hong Kong and what's happening in Singapore and what's happening in the UK, and share those ideas. On the EU front, in addition to interacting on the in IOSCO, I think we have very good, relationships with the EU. I think what's different to some degree is Brexit. And Brexit is dramatically changing the landscape for interactions of the EU with other parties. So to some degree, if you're setting up rules for how the EU is going to interact with other parties, it might change.
The way they interact with the United States.
Right. So I think that's going to be our what we all need to be thinking about, going forward, is sort of dealing with the ramifications of what's happening over there. And but I think we've had very good, productive conversations with the EU as we've gone through the last, since the financial crisis. I think there are lots of well-meaning, people trying to figure out ways that we can have effective regulation that's, efficient and not overly duplicative. We are constantly finding, places where our different regulatory regimes are affecting one another, and you have to figure out how to work through that.
Well, I know there are several members from the EU here who are very happy to certainly hear that. Brian?
Do you want me to go on to the...
FinTech and international.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it comes back to coordination, communication, conversation. you know, in addition to engaging with innovators, I think there's a lot to be gained from engaging with all of the other regulators. A lot of other jurisdictions have MOUs with each other. I'm not aware that the CFTC has any in this space. They may, but I'm not aware of
No, I don't think they do.
And you know, an MOU is fine, but you know, what do you get out of it? And I think the opportunity is to learn how other agencies in other jurisdictions are trying to approach the same problems we are. You know, Singapore at one point kind of banned fintech innovators from using the cloud. And then they realized, well, these aren't people that have a lot of hardware and infrastructure, you know, they're in their garage. And we're going to be really discouraging innovation if people can't use the environment, the modern environment, to advantage, you know, their thinking process and their creative thought process. Now, you know, sometimes you just have to learn from other people's mistakes. Hopefully, people won't be learning from our mistakes, but we may make some. But you know, to the extent that we can have that communication, I think it's going to make everyone more efficient, more effective at encouraging innovation.
Well, just as an outsider, oh, okay. Well, we do have a question from one of our distinguished guests. Okay, as we get to Mr. Newsom, one of the things I always wonder is when you talk about market access for even fintech, it does seem that in order to grant some kind of recognition or access, you do have to know exactly what they're doing, and so some kind of dialogue evaluating what their piloting programs are, what kind of engagement processes there are, that would kind of seem relevant to deepening coordination.
You know, but at the
regulation.
same time, we can't. I don't think we should be creating, you know, regulatory economies of scale, right? Where we're imposing so many requirements for registration or for participation that we're discouraging new entrants into the marketplace.
And creating new oligopolies.
Yeah,
or something.
exactly.
Yeah.
Brian, congratulations on your sponsorship of the Technology Advisory Committee.
Thank
I
you,
think
Jim.
it's an exciting time to serve in that role. And I know you're just getting your feet on the ground, getting your staff put together, but have you had time to start formulating an agenda or priorities for the committee moving forward?
Yeah, well, my goal is to have our first meeting by the end of the year, which is going to be a tight time frame because, you know, this ends up being herding cats, really, to get everyone coordinated and to get here and to have an agenda, and we haven't quite finalized the membership, but we're very close. But one of the things I want to talk about and use that first meeting for is to lay out the agenda and ask for input on the agenda. And I kind of think of it in you know, 4 main areas, maybe with the opportunity to do others. One is on the modern trading environment and the risks associated with it, with, you know, the prior commission putting out different versions of what they called Reg AT, with which I strongly disagreed because I think it defined the population so broadly that practically anybody that turned on a computer would have been classified as an algorithmic trading person and been subject to the same requirements as the most sophisticated HFT firms. And so it was a really big missed opportunity, I think, to address where is the risk in the marketplace, where incentives don't align, and is there an opportunity or is there a need to address it through regulation. Another is the cybersecurity and the internal data protection issue, to get information back from the industry as to our standards and what we're doing, and to provide them with information so that they either have comfort or make recommendations. You know, I think that there's an opportunity to do something on DLT and on blockchain. If the commission comes forward with a proposal on what actual delivery means, to maybe engage with that through a subcommittee or through the full committee. And then I think, you know, it's a great platform, I think, to try to bring in some of the folks that come into the Lab CFTC office hours. You know, Lab CFTC is hosting office hours here in DC, up in New York. Dan's having Lab CFTC in Chicago, office hours tomorrow. Maybe we get some of these innovators and bring them before the TAC and have them make a presentation and give them some feedback or have that inform a dialogue about regulatory opportunities around those. So, but I'm also soliciting input, so give me some ideas. Thanks for the question, Jim.
Okay, well, dinner time. No, this was a wonderful opportunity to talk to both of you. I appreciate you both taking the time out to come down to Georgetown. Hope to have you both back again. Let's please thank our commissioners.
For the second FinTech.
Yeah.
For the second FinTech next year.